The origin of the word monster has to do with something that is other, something outside of what is normal, which makes it hard to define. I mean, how do you define something that resists definition? In this class, we're going to look at something called monster theory and teach you how to read monsters, whether you find them in popular culture or you find them in the pages of the Bible. I want to start this class today by referencing John 7:24. Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead make a right judgment. In that passage, Jesus is warning us that just because something looks different or out of the norm at first does not mean it's bad or horrible. We need to pause, think through our judgments, and then make a right call. This is especially true when it comes to dealing with monsters. Whether we see them on the movie screen, or we're flipping through the books of Daniel and Revelation, or looking at Job and reading about Leviathan, or reading about the Witch of Endor, or even when we see images of Jesus and God that appear to be a little extreme. How do we read monsters? What do they represent? Why do we use them? Why do cultures have monsters and monster stories? In 1996, my friend Jeffrey Cohen, who is the Dean of Humanities at Arizona State University, created what's known as monster theory. He did this because we did not have a lot of ways to read monsters. What do they represent to a particular culture? Why do we make them? And how do they function? And so, creating this theory, he wanted to answer the question, how do you define something whose very nature is about breaking out of definitions? Before we dig into monster theory, there's some terms I want you to be familiar with. Take a look at this picture as we work through these terms. First is teratology. That is the study of abnormalities. Next is epistemology. That is the study of knowledge, or how do we know what we know. Ontology is the study of being. What does it mean to be in the world, to exist? Okay, so back to monster theory. Monster theory is a theory that helps us read monsters. Again, I want to make the point right away that monsters aren't always evil. Monsters mean something that is other. As children, most of us grew up playing imaginative games. We imagined ourselves as cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, doctors, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, cheerleaders, astronauts, police officers, whatever it was. That's one way we make sense of the world. Psychologists tell us that we use play and imagination to put things into categories, to try on identities, to try on tasks, to figure out how the world works. And so by the time we reach adulthood, we have our categories fairly set. We know what's normal and we know what's abnormal until a monster shows up, which tends to be something that breaks our categories and doesn't give us much reference for who they are, what they are, or why they're there in the first place. Jeffrey Cohen in his book, and others who use monster theory, make a very important point. The word monster, if you get into its origin, doesn't always mean evil. That's typically how we use it. We usually say monster is something bad. They're a real monster. Or we use it to reference size. That's a monstrous burrito. But really what the word monster means is a couple things. First of all, in ancient times, back in Augustine's day, he would have used it to reference a sign or a portent or a divine omen that needed to be read. What does it mean that someone has, 7 fingers or 1 eye or something different? That must be God telling us something if we're to read nature. The second thing that monster means is simply other, something that is outside of our categories, which we'll talk about in a second, which is why we tend to be scared of them. We figure we have the world figured out, everything's categorized, and then this other thing shows up and we don't know what to do with it. So, Jeffrey Cohen creates 7 theses, 7 statements, 7 elements to his monster theory to help us understand how to read monsters, what they are, who they are, and how they function. The first thesis is the monster is a cultural body. So what does that mean? The monster as a cultural body has to do with the idea that any monster you encounter, whether it's in the pages of scripture, or on the screen, or in a novel, represents the cultural fears and anxieties of the culture that created it, or describing it. Monsters are effective because they represent real fears and anxieties in the world. A monster would just be silly or stupid or not scary if it didn't represent something very real to us. Let me give you an example from popular culture. Take a look at this picture. What you're seeing here are characters from the Netflix show Squid Game. It became a very popular show, millions of views, and there's a sequel in the works. It's sort of a darker version of the Hunger Games. It's disturbing, it's dystopian, but it embodies a very real fear that people have in South Korea, which is where the show originates. They've actually adopted the costumes from the show in protests in South Korea to represent people being overworked and underpaid. In the show, people with unimaginable debt are selected to compete in these deadly games, with the last survivor getting enough money to pay off their debts and to have a happy life. For people in South Korea and other parts of the world who feel like their debt is unmanageable, that there's no hope, the show represents how desperate people will become to try to escape financial ruin and the stress of working in the modern world. It's a sobering thought when you watch the series through that lens. The second thesis is the monster always escapes. If you're familiar at all with any sort of sci-fi or horror franchise, you know that they make sequel after sequel after sequel. Just think about how many Dracula movies there are. How is it that we haven't managed to kill him yet? How many stakes have been driven through the heart? How many times has he been lit on fire? I don't know. How many times have we thought it was over, only to have him rise again to terrorize the human population? Especially movies like Alien or Predator. I've lost count of how many sequels there are. They just keep coming back. Just when you think they're gone, they come back. They always escape. Now, from a Christian standpoint, we can take a look at the Bible and we can look at sinful, monstrous behavior and see that pride and murder and lying keep coming back time after time after time. Even when God's people experience consequences to their actions and things are okay for a while, it keeps coming back. The good news for the Christian is that when Jesus returns and the world is made new, monstrous behavior and the monstrous will be put to rest forever. But until then, we have to be on our guard because they always come back. Thesis 3 is the monster is a harbinger of category crisis. This gets back to the idea of when we were playing as kids and imagining ourselves in the world as different things, learning to categorize life. A monster is something that breaks our categories. It doesn't fit. Often they're referred to as category jammers. They're a mix-up, a mashup of different things that does not fit anything that we've encountered before. The best example I have, and you can see it here in this picture, is the monsters from Daniel and Revelation, the beasts. You've got four-headed leopards, you've got lions with wings, you've got this great iron beast that looks like a dragon with jaws and claws, you have all kinds of horns, one has a face and it's talking. That's not normal. That's a mashup of all different kinds of things. And so in the Bible, you can see these monsters highlighting Thesis 3. The monsters are a harbinger of category crisis. Think through the monsters that you grew up with, things that you've seen or read or were told, and think of how they are a mashup of different elements. Thesis 4, the monster dwells at the gate of difference. If you remember, earlier on I said that the monster is something other than what is normal. It is difference personified and embodied. One of the tragic ways we have seen this is in war propaganda. Much of war propaganda seeks to demonize the enemy, to dehumanize them, to make them other and monstrous. We're not killing people, we're killing monsters. We use the category monster to determine what is normal and what is not. Usually, I am normal and you're the monster. The enemy is the monster. The enemy is not human, but we here in our church, in our family, in our business, whatever it is, we're the normal ones, they're the monstrous ones. So we use monster as a way to sort of draw the boundary lines between what is acceptable and what is not in a culture. Thesis 5, the monster polices the borders of the possible. In the last several theses in Cohen's theory, what we see is a progression from horror and confusion to curiosity and even desire. What we see is maybe still some recoil about the monster we're reading about or watching, but also looking at its possibilities. What might this monster mean for us? What could happen if we could create more of these monsters? Perhaps the best example is taken from the film Jurassic Park, the film about where an ambitious businessman reanimates dinosaurs, and as you probably know, it does not go well. There's a key scene that's become a meme that's been shared all over the internet in various forums, and it's from Jeff Goldblum's character. And he says this, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." That encompasses the whole idea. The monster polices the borders of the possible. We become fascinated by it. We think about, man, what if I could bring dinosaurs back? Or what if I could create a artificial intelligence that would solve all of the problems, whether it's robots or cyborgs, or what if we could create super soldiers to get things done? What's possible with the monstrous, with the other? And again, if science fiction or horror or adventure films or action films have taught us anything, it usually backfires and blows up in our face. Thesis 6, the fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. This sounds kind of weird. What would be desirable about the monster? Why would we want the monstrous in our lives? I mean, if you've had the experience of seeing any sort of horrible monster media, you know that it's not anything that a sane person would desire. However, when you look a little deeper and you think a little harder about it, what abilities does the monster have that you might like to have? What sort of power and strength might be a type of desire? Thesis 7, the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. This one's kind of tricky to unpack. The main idea from Cohen is the monsters show up to interrogate us as to why we created them. Why did we create them? Why did you make this monster? Why did you label these people as monstrous, this community as monstrous, these others as monstrous? Why did you write this story, make this movie? Why are you drawn to it? What is it about the monster that says something about you? The best example I can think of to look at is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you're familiar with the book Frankenstein, you know that it's about Dr. Frankenstein. The monster's not actually called Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein gets ambitious, tries to play God, and reanimates a corpse that he's put together. And then he abandons it because he's terrified, and the monster is left, tragically, alone to wander around the world, getting into trouble. At the very end of the book, the monster shows up and interrogates Dr. Frankenstein as to the reason he was created. And it's a really sad moment in the book as the monster questions Dr. Frankenstein. Let me show you one of the quotes. "Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turn from me in disgust?" And so there's a lot of ways to read Frankenstein. There's countless dissertations and books on it. But just off the top of my head, we have someone who tried to play God, didn't think through the consequences, created this being and abandoned it. And now the monster shows up to say, it's because of your ambition, your blind desire, that you decided to create me. And it was so horrible that you left me to wander the world alone, getting into all kinds of horrific trouble and heartache. And so it gives us pause when we are looking at whatever it is that scares us, whatever we see as monstrous, to ask, what about this creature, this being, this other, says something about me? Why did I create it? Jeffrey Cohen's theory has been around since 1996. It pains me to say that's a long time because I was 16 then and I don't like to think about how old I am now. But it's an important theory that many people and many disciplines have built on, including religion and theology. So much so that a recent book looking at religion and the monstrous came out, adding 5 more theses to Jeffrey Cohen's original theory. The book, which you can see here, is entitled Religion, Culture, and the Monstrous. The 5 additional theses go like this. Number 1 is monsters are a second-order category. This is a really tricky one to unpack, but the main idea is that monster is not a natural category, like tree or circle. A monster is something we have to manufacture. A monster is something that happens when scholars, preachers, individuals look at something that looks different and say, that's a monster. Thesis 2. Monsters imply and, paradoxically, preserve categories. Again, this goes back to Cohen's thesis number 4 about monsters dwelling at the gates of difference. We use the term monster to not only create categories for those other people, those other things over there, but to preserve our categories of normal. It's a popular tool used by preachers, propagandists, political pundits, social media influencers. It's a great way, again, to say, this is normal, this is the normal category, this is what we should all aspire to, not whatever that is over there. Monsters are phenomenologically actual. The word phenomenology is one my students get tripped over all the time. It's hard to say, and sometimes it's even harder to remember. Think of the word phenomena or phenomenon. It's a thing that happened in the world, right? So phenomenology simply refers to things that we experience, things that we encounter. So for a monster to be phenomenologically real, it means that even if we know that a particular monster doesn't live in the closet or under the bed, it's experienced as though it does. This is important for people doing ethnography and anthropology, people studying different cultures. We might step into a different culture and think, this is crazy. I don't believe that there is an abominable snowman, that there is Bigfoot, that there's a boogeyman somewhere. And that may be true. But the fact of the matter is, that idea, that monster, is so embedded in that culture that it's experienced as true. And that deserves some respect. And so while I'm talking to somebody who might have a belief in aliens or the chupacabra, whatever it might be, I need to hold space for two ideas. Number one, I don't believe this is a real thing. And number two, I need to listen with empathy to somebody who's experiencing real fear and anxiety. And once they get to know me a little bit better, maybe we can have some dialogue that can ease their fears and tensions. Another thing to think about in this is that when you get a preacher or a political pundit who tends towards conspiracy theories, they can weave tales that are absolutely monstrous and absolutely not true, but people experience them as true. They believe them as true. So you might know that the Illuminati and the Jesuits are not hiding behind every single bush. But for that person that's gotten wrapped up in that narrative, it's a very real fear and anxiety. And finally, thesis number 5, monsters can be at the center or the periphery. This gets into a really weird cultural dynamic. Many different cultures and societies have monsters they like to keep at arm's length, and monsters they bring right into their homes and their culture. Going back to my early example in the very first class, Seventh-day Adventists typically do not support monsters, the monstrous, and horror. And yet, our evangelistic materials are filled with fearful, frightening images of beasts. What's more, even the most conservative evangelists and ministries, when they seek to deconstruct or criticize monster media or popular culture, will often still use the images from that popular culture to put on their materials to get people to listen in or to attend their meetings. They recognize that there's something effective about the monstrous, even if they're going to deconstruct it in the meetings. And so while we might verbally say, we don't support that, we don't want anything to do with that, we will still use those images on our materials, putting them front and center, putting them into people's homes and in our meetings. Other cultures have different ways of doing this. For example, here in the United States, we have Bigfoot. In the Pacific Northwest, there are people who are rabid followers of Bigfoot, this mythical creature that allegedly wanders the wilderness. There are shops, there are buttons, there are souvenirs. Now, most people would be pretty terrified, even if they think they want to encounter Bigfoot, would be pretty terrified if they ran into a Bigfoot in the forest. What would you do? This thing might be bloodthirsty, it could overpower you, and yet there's this fascination with it. So we have t-shirts and hats and gatherings and conventions. We do this with a variety of things. In Europe, there is what's known as Krampus, what I call the anti-Claus. Krampus is sort of a monstrous version of Santa Claus that shows up and that threatens, I believe, to eat small children who have been misbehaving. And there are parades through the streets with people wearing horrific costumes and interacting with children. And so this thing is a monster, and yet it's brought to the very center of the culture to embody certain ideas. In West Virginia, we have the Mothman and corresponding statue and festival there. We have so many different ways that we take monsters that are on the periphery and make them the center to explain certain values, anxieties, fears, and histories in our culture. Finally, thesis 5, monsters have social consequences. I brought this up in the last class, but it bears repeating. Whatever we label as monstrous has social consequences. When you decide to put the label monster on somebody, you are opening them up to all kinds of abuse and criticism, and in some ways you're opening yourself up to justifying behavior that is unchristlike. So be very, very careful, because unfortunately Christian history is littered with terrible examples of how the people of Christ have labeled other people as monstrous and done terrible things to them. So to wrap up this class, I want to leave you with some questions to reflect on. Number 1, what monsters exist in your life, in your past? Whether it was on the screen, in a book, in the pages of Scripture, a story your uncle told you around the campfire, what monsters are there? What scares you? And then they ask the question, what does that monster represent? What sort of fears and anxieties? Why am I bothered by that particular monster? Question number 2, where do you see it, either in your own life, your church's life, or the lives of people around you, your culture, your family? Where do you see people using the term monster? And how are they using it? Are they using it to reinforce categories? Are they using it to demonize another group? Where do you see the concept of monster being used in your life? And the final question, having to do with the fact that monsters have social consequences. Where in your life have you seen the term monster result in monstrous consequences? Where have you seen people using monstrous language, demonizing language, and what have the results of that been? And how might you be able to change that narrative?